When moving to a new country as an expat for the first time, there's a good chance you're going to run into a lot of concepts that you simply haven't had to deal with when you're living in your home country. Just things you've never had to stop and think about because you're just at a new life stage and you're encountering them. And one of those is having a firm understanding, not just a local tax understanding, but a deeper understanding of the difference between a salary and a dividend, profits and payment when you're working at a company. Now, these are things that most people are aware of the terms, and they probably have thought about them to some degree, but not to the degree necessary to really understand them and apply them well to a new life living abroad. So we're going to cover some of that. Hi, I'm Scott Allen Miller. This is my life living in Leon, Nicaragua. I've been an expat outside the United States since about 2012, and I have been living as an immigrant here in Nicaragua for the last 5 years-ish, depending on when you define me becoming an immigrant. But I am a permanent resident here in Nicaragua, and I am an investor internationally and have worked around the world for a very long time. So I'd like to share a little bit of this insight to help you understand some of the important nuances of how money goes from work to you as an expat right after the bump. Being an expat often means experiencing new things in our lives. Maybe not exotic things. Sometimes it's super exotic, right? I'm traveling to a new continent. I'm living in a completely new type of place. I'm eating new food. I'm speaking a new language. We have a lot of exoticism as expats in most cases, but there's also some very mundane everyday things that we experience often for the first time or deeply for the first time as expats. And having to really understand the difference between the profits of a business and our salary from a business are definitely things that we rarely think deeply about. But let's explain really quickly. As an employee of a business, you're generally familiar with the concept of a salary or your payment, right? You are rewarded for labor that you do for a business. Now, that business could be a person, right? Your neighbor hires you to cut their grass. You're being paid as an employee. Maybe a local business hires you to be a cashier at their grocery store, or maybe a giant international company hires you to weld parts on vehicles that they are producing at a factory. It doesn't matter in all these cases. A business is doing work, it is generating money, and it is paying you for labor that you do for them. We all realize that this is a salary. We're used to this. It is not a surprise. Being a worker is not an exotic thing on its own. So we're very used to this concept of, I have a job, I am paid to work at that job. That is a salary. And when we talk about whether or not you can, and we're gonna take some specific examples here in Nicaragua. We've got this general case for the people who are here just for that. And then I have a lot of my audience watch because we talk about Nicaragua. So I'm gonna apply some of this to the specific scenarios of being from the United States and living in Nicaragua. If you were talking about working in Nicaragua, people are saying, well, I wanna look for a job. I wanna move to Nicaragua. I wanna have the right to work. I wanna be able to find a job. I need Nicaragua to pay me. They're talking about working a job in Nicaragua and pulling a salary, right? You're an employee. You're doing labor. You are receiving payment for that labor. Seems straightforward, but it's amazing when you start moving internationally how often people start to confuse where they're working, how they're working, who's paying them, and so forth, because we don't have to think about it as normal everyday workers. You just show up and someone hands you a paycheck and you assume everything just makes sense, and it generally does, so it's very easy. But you start moving internationally, you start having your own businesses, and things get messy fast because we aren't thinking about where you're from, where you are, where the work is being done, who's paying, where is the money coming from, and so forth. It starts getting murky. So salaries are straightforward. Now, if you live in Nicaragua, but you take a job in, let's say, the United States or Canada or the UK, and they're paying you and that money is coming from abroad, you are an employee, but not a Nicaraguan employee. You're an employee in that place, right? So if I work for a company in the United States as an employee, as I do, right? I live in Nicaragua, but I work in Texas, right? My salary comes from Texas. My pay comes from Texas. My employer is in Texas, and so forth. So I am an American employee. I am doing foreign earned income, right? That term comes from the fact that I have income, a salary, right? Or as the United States calls it, an earned income, right? Very important. I am working labor and I'm earning my income. So that's a salary. Right? So we talk about this a lot. If that's the scenario you're in, living in Nicaragua, working in the United States, so you have that foreign earned income, that is generally tax exempt. And by generally, I mean the first bit of it is always tax exempt as long as you're actually doing the things I said. And then it's that simple, right? A lot of people will argue because they're trying to trick you into not taking your exemptions or to not moving to some other country. But these are real tax advantages you just get. Now, when we say you really live somewhere, there's you have to do it for an amount of time. It's not like one day, but it's very straightforward. And so that's how salary applies. Now, when you go and start a business, this is where things get tricky because most expats have never owned a business previously. If they have, it's generally not a very big one or successful one, maybe didn't have employees or whatever, so they may not have gotten to a point that they went through a lot of concepts. Of course, somebody has, right? Probably 1 out of 20, 1 out of 25 expats has had a successful enough business on the outside that they're bringing knowledge of these things to the inside. And if that's you, you probably don't need anything from this video or very little. That's fine. But for the majority of expats, you have never and will never actually have a business. But for many of you who are coming here for the first time, you are considering a business and you're looking at different rules and regulations and trying to figure out how things apply. And if you have a business, let's start with what if you have a business in the United States or in Canada or whatever, and it keeps going and you are living here in Nicaragua, and ignore any salary. Let's just say you're retired. You have this business and it makes profits. If things don't make profits, things get really easy, right? It's like, do you pay taxes on zero? It doesn't matter. It's zero. But let's say you're having a profit, it doesn't have to be a big profit. You're making profit somewhere and you're going to collect that money. Well, that's not a salary, that is a dividend. Or if you want to look at it from the IRS perspective, it is an unearned income. That doesn't mean you stole it. It just means you did not put in labor in order to get that work. You put in investment to get that work. And that investment could be anything that we call rentista, right? You could be owning a stock, it could be owning a bond, it could be owning real estate, it could be having rental properties, it could be being a member of an LLC or something like that, right? Anything like that, that an unearned, you're not doing labor and the money keeps coming in type of work is unearned income or a dividend. It's basically lumped into one thing, technically, depending on where you're looking. Right? So that, if you're coming from the United States, for example, is taxed, but at a different rate. So it's not generally a big deal, but it is taxed, assuming you're an American and doing those things. There are some really extreme exemptions, right? You're going to want to look those things up. Someone just taught me about that there is a way for foreigners to have businesses in the U.S. that do absolutely no business or pay nothing in the U.S. and have no taxes at all, which is weird, but they're not doing anything either, right? So if you are pulling that money in a dividend from the United States, from the United States perspective, there's no salary. So this is where people get confused because they start saying, well, I'm going to start a business, let's say in Nicaragua or the place that they're moving to. And they start talking about profits and they're like, well, I don't know if that business is going to be profitable. And the problem is twofold. One, as an investor, you want your business to return money to you based on the investment that you've done. So let's say you put in $100,000 to start up a business in the country that you're moving to. Well, you hope that that $100,000 generates you income, has nothing to do with salary. You as an investor are hoping that that brings a return, and a good return is about 10% or higher. Remember, you're doing private ownership, not a stock. If you're doing like really good stocks, you expect to get like 9% reliably. So if you're going to do something else, you expect better than that, maybe 10%, maybe 20%, right? That'd be great. So you're expecting at least $10,000 to be generated by that business, even if you never show up and do any work, especially if you don't show up and do any work, right? $10,000 would be an adequate return on that investment from the simple fact that you own that business for the year. Now, you may not get that every year. Some years it may be higher, some lower. Like there's lots of fungible numbers in there, and you might be okay. I just love this business. I don't care that it's only returning 8%. That's fine. That's your decision. Just giving you some math, right? So we expect a minimum of 10% to be returned for a business to be worth it from a business perspective to have invested in. If it's not returning that, then you are losing money because you could have done something with your investment that reliably would have returned about 9%. Obviously, from a financial perspective, that would be smarter. Now, some people look at that and say, well, my business is profitable, but it's only making 1 or 2%. Well, that's a very arguable point, but maybe it's profitable, but it's not really beating inflation. So it's actually losing money, right? So that's not good. If it's not hitting 9%, it's losing money compared to simply holding it someplace better that doesn't take any effort from you. So it's still losing money in an investment perspective. Now, generally we say there's no way for your business in Nicaragua as an expat to make money. Chances are, not only is it not going to hit that 9% to beat the investment baseline, it's probably not going to hit 2 or 3% to hit the inflation baseline. We're worried it's going to hit the 0. Chances are it's going to lose hard money and lose tons of relative money. Not always, but that's the expectation. And when we say you're not going to be profitable, we are saying all these numbers, all of them you're likely to lose on. No matter how you gauge profitability, you're probably going to lose. Maybe not, but probably. But then there's a second piece. Most people assume that they're going to be owner-operators of their own business, meaning they are going to maybe be a chef or a cook. Maybe they will be a waiter. Maybe they'll be a manager. Maybe they will be a greeter, right? Whatever. It depends on the kind of business you have. But they expect that they will probably work in it and put in their own labor. Now, when you do that, you're probably expecting to be paid a salary. So if you do this, if you get that profit here in country, we'll just imagine you do get some profit, even if it's not enough that we would consider it profitable. All it has to do is be above 0 for the government to consider it a profit and tax you, right? So we're assuming you're pulling in something that hits a dividend tax. That is a dividend. It has nothing to do with your labor. If you work for yourself, you would expect to pay yourself. Now, in most jurisdictions, they allow you to not pay yourself, and you can optionally simply take dividends and consider your labor to be a benefit of the dividend in the long run. That's generally allowed, but check your jurisdiction. If you want to get paid a salary like a real laborer and keep things clean and make things make sense, then you may want to work for yourself. And this is important to keep these things separate. What you pull as a profit is unrelated to what you are paid. If you choose not to get paid, you have to consider your profits need to cover what would have been your salary. If you have a company that makes 5%, which is a losing company, and you're working full-time for it, not only are you working full-time for free, technically we would consider you from an investment perspective to be paying to go to work, just to be clear. So when we're talking about you can't work in Nicaragua, as an example, it is not that you can't invest. That has nothing to do with working. I'm sure they exist, but I know of no country in the world that doesn't allow you to invest and own a business, or at least be an investor in a business, right? That is not something that countries generally prohibit, but most countries heavily restrict or prohibit the ability to work and pull a salary. Right, so those are things you have to keep completely separate in your mind, because they are not crossover concepts. They're very different things. Investing and working are not directly related. Now, if you work in that business and pull a salary, you are getting income. That has to go through a completely different system. We're used to this in the U.S. If you're paying, percentages on your profits, it's completely different than what you're paying in a salary. Now, there are some situations in the United States where they allow you to blend those two at the end of the year. That gets super confusing. It's fine from a tax perspective, but it's very hard to explain. So we will not consider that here, and is not going to go on here. So you have this dual system. You have to consider that. So what many people think is they'll randomly jump back and forth between these concepts to try to justify running a business that fundamentally probably doesn't make sense. They'll be like, well, I'm going to make all this profit, but they're not making profit. They're losing money. They're not even trying to gauge their profit. What they're trying to do is pay themselves a salary. That would be okay if you work for yourself and you pay yourself a salary. Not up to you if that's how you want to handle it. But generally, people don't pay themselves enough salary to really be happy. And then they're like, well, but I'm losing money, and they start to feel it. Right? And so you have to be able to compartmentalize and say, okay, is the business making money, and am I being paid adequately for the work that I do? So when people are here and try to do things, they quickly realize generally that they are losing money, and it's just very painful. But people who are hypothesizing that they want to come here and want to give it a try and want to start a business, they will say things like, well, I don't care how much profit I make, I just want to have a place where I can work. And that sounds great, but that salary, right, would need to be enough to pay for your time. And once you start saying, oh, what would that salary need to be? And then check what the salaries are in a country, generally they don't match up. And that's where you run into difficult things. But keeping these ideas separate is very important, because all those taxes go to different places. Here in Nicaragua, DHE handles the one and INS handles the other. In the United States, the IRS has one as unearned income and one as earned income. One has huge advantages for living abroad. One has no advantages for living abroad. No penalties, but no advantages. Right? You have to keep these concepts separate in order to write it all down on paper and figure out what your financial picture will be. And that's what you should do. If you're looking at potentially investing anywhere, Nicaragua being a great example of just how hard it would be, write down what you think is going to happen. I have X amount of money to start a business. It's going to cost me this amount of money, and assume anything you put down is going to be between half and a tenth of what it's actually going to cost, right? That's what people are off by. But let's say you're like, I'm going to put in 50,000. Well, it's going to be 100 to half a million, right? That's the realistic number. And you're like, okay, so I need to put that much in. Is this business going to be able to return 10% to 20% of what you put in every year in profits if you don't show up to work, or you do, but just to oversee a few things now and then? You really aren't working. Is that true? Okay. Now, if you go to work at your own business, can it produce those profits that you're happy in and also have it pay you a salary for working there that you're happy with to receive as a salary? Start to figure that out, because most people can do one or the other if they're doing really, really, really well. Even that is a miracle in most cases. But mixing them together and making no money, actually losing money from an investment perspective, and paying a partial salary, people will often lower their bar and say, oh, I'm being successful. So if you go out and talk to a business, they're like, are you making money? They'll be like, I am making money. You say, okay, how much are you being paid as a salary? And they'll come up with some really low number. Well, I'm making $1,000 a month. Okay, wow, that's really low. Are you really okay working full time and carrying all this risk to work for just $1,000 a month? I understand working for yourself, that has value. Working in the tropics, in paradise, that has value. Having a low cost of living, that has value, a lot of value. But are you really happy with $1,000 a month being your income? Well, I'm okay to put up with it. Okay, I'm okay with that. Now, let's look at your investment number. So you put in, we'll say, $250,000 to be able to do this. You bought, who knows, a small hotel, a restaurant, you had to buy chairs, and you had to buy beer, and you had to buy food, and you had to hire staff. And so you put in $250,000, and now you're working at it, making $1,000 a month. The $1,000 a month is definitely not great. You could take an online job doing part-time somewhere and pull that off tax-free, right? If you're making that money in country, you're paying tax on it because you're a very taxable entity, right? You're at 5 times minimum wage. You are definitely going to be paying a lot of taxes here in Nicaragua. So you're not going to be realizing 1,000 from that 1,000 salary in any way, shape, or form. If you made 1,000 remotely from a job like in the US or Canada, and you were living in Nicaragua, that would be tax-free. Well, from the US, it would be tax-free. Canada would not be, right? That goes a lot farther and helps the country more. We always have to mention that. That's the thing that helps the country the most. You're not making your money off of Nicaragua. You're spending your money in Nicaragua. That's what they're hoping for. But so if you're pulling that 1,000 and paying taxes, you're only getting the spending power of, I don't know, $600. You say, well, is your investment doing really, really well so that you don't really care what you're being paid? Is your investment bringing in a minimum of $25,000 a year, free and clear extra money that you wouldn't have had otherwise? Maybe more, as much as $50,000. That'd be really pushing it. And then people will be like, oh, no, it's not bringing in any profits. If I had profits, I would pay myself more. You say, okay, so you're not profitable, you're losing. Not only are you not making profit, you are actually losing on the investment side, and you're not being paid an adequate salary that you'd be happy with, that is equal to what you could make working somewhere abroad remotely from here. We're not saying leave Nicaragua. We're saying find a way to work online, right? You'd be bringing in probably a minimum of $2,000. So you're losing $1,000 a month on the salary and potentially losing $25,000 to $50,000 on the investment, because many people actually lose their investment, right? You put in $250,000, and over time, probably you overpaid for the property that you bought. You probably overpaid for the labor. You probably overpaid for a whole bunch of things. You may be eroding on the investment side and on the salary side. And understanding that those two things are discrete, monitoring them and evaluating them individually is key. And then looking at the big picture of, for most people, it is that they are losing in both, but will report that they are profitable because they have no means of evaluating. They don't know how to look at these things. They don't know how to think about it. And so when you go and talk to expats, you will often get very misleading information and be like, why do they say that they're profitable, but they're clearly struggling so much? How could they be struggling if they're working full time? Where's their salary going? And they're profitable? Why aren't they growing and doing more? It's because neither of those is likely true. They're probably paying themselves a partial salary and voluntarily giving their labor to backstop the losses from the failed investment. That's what most people find. So this came up because someone was saying they're interested in potentially investing in order to create a job for themselves. And people don't realize that not only do you have to make the investment not lose, which is hard enough, but you have to make the job actually pay, which is basically impossible as well. It's two extremely hard things that if you don't manage to pull off both, you have a real financial problem. Now, of course, if you have an investment that does well and you're not working at it, then that works out fine, right? Then that's far more likely to work, but that's not what most people are looking for. Most people aren't really prepared to have a mostly hands-off business where it's able to maintain profitability while they're off doing something else. That is a completely different animal and difficult, but important when you're looking at investing. We have a tendency as expats doing this stuff for the first time to blend a bunch of concepts together and never have needed to break it all apart to really evaluate what they're doing before. And even for people who've done this in other countries, generally you have to have done a lot of different scenarios over a long period of time to have run into these things to really get to a point where you're deeply understanding them intuitively and able to look at this stuff so fast. I'm lucky that I've had more than a quarter century doing this stuff, and at my own companies we'd have times where we're like, it's better for me to go work on the outside. My salary is so much higher, even if we take a lower profit because I'm not there helping the company, because we don't have to pay my salary, we can pay someone cheaper to do my work, and the profits don't go down that much. My income is so much higher. We have to evaluate those things because the bigger picture is what really matters. And so we switch back and forth as it makes sense. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, give me a thumbs up, watch another video, buy me a coffee, information on the screen, information in the show notes, leave a comment, send in a video of yourself, please, please, please. I love video questions and video comments. And of course, tell someone about the show. Share this on social media. Let another video roll and roll and roll in the background. I love it when you guys do that because it really does help. And I will see all of you tomorrow.